sometimes, and I think that this is something that the news media struggles with, is that people don't trust them, even though very often the mainstream media isn't out to mislead people and isn't out to push an agenda. I think most working reporters are out to report the truth. The company is evolving and understands that it's not the past anymore. We ultimately want to build tools that developers can use regardless of what platform you're on.
Welcome to the Hacker Noon podcast. I'm your host, Trent Lapinski. In this episode, I interviewed Christina Warren. She's formerly of Mashable and Gizmodo and is now working for Microsoft. In this episode, we cover everything from fake news to the journalism apocalypse to what's happening with Apple and Microsoft and what's happening in the tech industry in general. So this is a great episode. If you're interested in journalism and learning from one of the industry's best, Christina's amazing, so please stay tuned.
Greetings, hacker. Ever wonder how to submit stories to Hacker Noon or check the status of your submissions? Well, wonder no more. Go to contribute.hackernoon.com. Whether you're a new writer, longtime contributor, or looking for the right place to spotlight your brand, get started with contribute.hackernoon.com. With your help, we are building Hacker Noon 2.0 to be the best place for tech professionals to publish, and it starts with a new submission flow. Head over to contribute.hackernoon.com today to claim your spot. You are Hacker Noon.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm here with Christina Warren. She's formerly of Mashable and Gizmodo and is now working at Microsoft in the cloud division. So, hey, Christina, tell us a bit about who you are and what you're working on.
Yeah. So like you said, I used to be a technology and business journalist, and now I work in developer relations at Microsoft as a senior cloud advocate. And with that, I basically interact a lot with our product groups where I kind of try to get feedback from our users about what things are good, what things might need to be improved, get insights into how people are using things and try to make our stuff better. I also do a lot of our video content and kind of think a lot about what types of content we're making for YouTube and other platforms. Which is interesting, right? Because I used to be a journalist and a big part of I still kind of am in the sense that I do podcasts and I definitely still consider myself like a storyteller and kind of a journalist at heart. But I used to have to break down complicated technical topics for mainstream audiences. And now it's similar, but it's, a technical, a developer-centric audience that you're trying to maybe explain or surface what's happening, and then sometimes speaking with, product teams and distilling back, the sort of feedback that we're getting and things that we're seeing so that they can focus on making stuff even better.
Yeah, and I'd really love to get your take on, what's happening with journalism today.
Yeah.
Because I've been following you for probably like 10 plus years now, and we've had kind of both parallel and opposite career paths. Because when I was into journalism, you I think you weren't quite on the scene yet. Then when I was leaving journalism, you came onto the scene and started writing for Mashable. And that was when I had just sold, one of my journalism sites and stopped writing and started working for MySpace founder startups and, whatever. You then had a very, very successul career as a journalist and you've written for some of the largest, tech news websites. What are your thoughts on kind of where journalism is at in 2019 and the kind of recent journalism apocalypse we're seeing?
Yeah, no, so it sucks, right? There's no other way to say it. It was interesting. When I got into media, I made a conscientious decision to focus on digital media and not print, so not newspapers or magazines. Because when I started first kind of writing, 2009 was, I guess, when I started working at Mashable, but I was doing some stuff earlier than that. I made the conscientious decision to focus on blogs and digital because I've always been a digital native. I've always loved the web. Even when I was in middle school and high school, I was building websites. I was writing about things. I've always loved that side of it. But I thought that I was this is just the direction media is going to go in, right? People don't, buy newspapers the same way. Magazines aren't, selling the way that they used to. Everybody's accessing things online. So why should I be trying to write, in print when that's going away? So I focused on digital, and I was very lucky in that I kind of got in early before kind of the big boom, I guess, really started. So you already had blogs and you already had people who were doing well, but I got in like right around the time that people started to maybe take it seriously and it became, a real business and a real industry. And so for the last 15 years, I would say, the media industry definitely been seeing a lot of growing pains and has had tons of layoffs. But again, most of them have been focused on print where, you see, print circulation is down and magazines are getting shut down and things are going online only. But you had this boom, I think, especially from probably like, 2010 through, recently the last decade or so, where digital, with the rise of things like BuzzFeed and Vice and, even websites, like Mashable, people kind of said this is going to be the future model and advertising is going to support this. And there's going to be, these social models that will pay for these things. And video is going to be a big component. And this is the future of media. This is the future of journalism. And then what you started seeing happening around 2016, but most recently getting really bad, is that you started to see the first wave of layoffs in digital media. And that we hadn't seen before, right? Like you might have seen it at legacy companies that had both digital and print sides, and maybe the digital side would get cuts too. So, your Condé Nast, your Hearst, maybe, some of your New York Times stuff, but you hadn't seen this impact the digital first companies, especially those that had received, venture funding and that, again, had kind of been hailed as like these future news things. And then starting in 2016, that started to change. And in the last just couple of months, it's gotten even worse. So I left working in media full time. I still do podcasts and I still, write occasionally in May of 2017. And between like the end of May when I left and I think the end of 2017, I don't even know how many digital layoffs there were a lot, and that's only and that's only continued to grow, right? Like
probably it's at least in the tens of thousands of journalists have lost their jobs in the last probably 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, I definitely.
Maybe
And it definitely has impacted, print people too. That still is definitely being hit. But I think that what's happened and what's had to make people reassess things is that it's not just that. So in the last couple of months since the beginning of this year, we've seen, Vice announce that they're going to be doing some restructuring and layoffs, and people don't know what that means. BuzzFeed laying off a large number of staffers. Huffington Post and the various AOL, Yahoo properties, what are they called? It was Oath, but now they've changed it to something else. I think maybe Yahoo Media or something, doing layoffs. Other digital sites doing things. Condé Nast, which obviously is still a print thing, but they've shifted into one newsroom having layoffs. BuzzFeed and Vice are Mike shutting down and selling for nothing when they had a couple of floors in One World Trade and had raised a bunch of money in venture. Mashable at the end of 2017 sold for like $50 million, but that was not a good exit. That was considered basically like they basically sold for what they raised, and that was seen as a failure.
Kind of a fire sale.
Yeah, totally. Obviously the lawsuits and things that are not directly related to a lot of this, but the demise of Gawker Media, which then became
Gizmodo, which is coming back now. Gawker actually is the property. Yeah, the domains got resold.
Yes, ironically, to the guy who bought Mike.com, Brian Goldberg, who originally created Bleacher Report. But anyway, you started to see these things that have been heralded as like the future of media now faltering, and the two biggest ones being Vice and BuzzFeed, because they had been super high value. Like I guess the third one on that would be Vox, and they've had some layoffs, but they've for the most part been okay. And it's scary, right? Because we all thought this digital advertising model and these other things are going to make up the slack. It's going to be able to make these endeavors profitable and worthwhile. And you finally started to convince people, especially I think in the case of something like BuzzFeed, that even though, they might get a lot of their traffic from listicles and cat videos and memes, there is some really good journalism and some really good reporting happening. People are finally starting to turn the corner and not roll their eyes that just because it's a digital only thing, you're like, oh, it can be good. And then it's almost like as soon as that happens, the bottom falls out. Some of it is because of business decisions that, companies made, I think, by relying too heavily on partnerships with companies like Facebook, and relying on them to maybe bring them traffic, and becoming too reliant, or making business decisions that, these platforms would not ultimately support. Some of it is
just pause you there, actually,
yeah,
because I think Facebook actually played a major role in this, because they changed their algorithm
completely.
after the 2016 election and after the Cambridge
Mm-hmm.
Analytica scandal. They completely shifted their algorithm. I don't know if listeners know this, but I'm just going to restate it quickly. So basically, Facebook changed their algorithm so that instead of being able to share content, they put an emphasis on being able to share personally within your network. So they
Yes.
put an emphasis on text only or photo
Or
only.
photos. Yes, exactly. They put it
Stop
instead of
promoting your news.
completely. And that was a huge, huge thing that started in 2016. Like you said, around the time of the election. But even before then, it started to hit. They started to, I think it was like early mid 2016 is when it really started. And at this point, that was kind of a bait and switch, because you'd had a lot of these media companies who'd built their businesses. I think Mike is actually a really good example, where they built their businesses and their scale and the amount of money they were trying to sell ads for and things like that on the back of Facebook, because Facebook said, we're going to be your platform. And then Facebook changes the rules. And when that happens and your traffic goes away, that's really hard. And, to keep your audience and to continue to pull in the sorts of, revenues that you were pulling in. I would say even worse than the algorithm change, I think, was their about face with Facebook Live, which was their video platform. So what a lot of people don't know is that when Facebook Live launched, and I guess it was like 2015, 2016, they paid news outlets to create content for them. And to get the money, you had to commit to a certain amount of content. And that was going to be different per publication. And the amount of money that they were paying, varied too. Obviously, bigger things are going to get bigger amounts of money. But you had a quota. And so to make these videos and fill this quota, you have to now hire video journalists. You have to hire editors. You have to hire people who are going to be able to create this content. And sometimes it can be reused, but a lot of times it can't. And so a lot of news organizations, believing that this was going to be a sustaining revenue stream, make these hires, make these pivots. And then what happens is that a year later, Facebook, when the contract renewals come up, they say, yeah, you know what? We don't really want to do this anymore. And so in 2017, they basically cut a lot of the partnerships completely. As some of them continued, some of them they were able to sell into Facebook Watch series, but very few and far between. And so if you'd done this quote unquote pivot to video, which is what a lot of media companies were doing in 2016, believing that it was going to pay off, Facebook again pulled the rug out after people had made business decisions. Now, some of this you have to put some culpability on the publications, because especially when Facebook has a history of changing terms, it's like, okay, why are you continuing to kind of give into this, and why are you building your business on this? So the publications have some culpability, but it also, at a certain point, you can understand why, if somebody's coming to your door and is saying, we're going to give you $500,000 or we're going to give you $1 million if you create this content, that you think that might be a sustainable thing, especially, and then it's up to their whims. And so,
I'd like to add, the numbers were also, there was an article that came out that stated that the numbers that they were showing, that Facebook was presenting, were fake.
Yes, that's exactly right. So it was even worse. It's like, not only are they backing off of the video processes, but the numbers they've been telling you that you're getting for views, that you're then giving to advertisers, that you're then holding up as your metrics, have been inflated. And maybe you haven't pursued other formats or other platforms because Facebook has become this big driver. And so what you started to see was that publications that were very largely dependent on Facebook for reach and for, direct traffic, and SEO and that sort of thing, and maybe even advertising, losing a lot of their visibility and a lot of their revenue. I mean, and that's one of the things that happened to Mike. And the problem is, journalism, even if it's digital, is expensive. Most of these companies are based in expensive cities. You have offices. It costs money to do this, and so if you're not bringing enough in, if you're not fully profitable, then it gets harder to raise money if the tools you've been relying on at the people who you think are partners for growth are changing the rules. Then how do you convince somebody else to give you more money to continue doing something? And I mean, look, and even if you're profitable, even if you're being successful, I mean, BuzzFeed's a great example where they're doing well. Like if you actually look at their numbers, their revenue, they came in under projections, but they're still doing really well. But that's not good enough because, I mean, this I think can be applied to startups. This is really good. It's not unique to the news business. This is a reality of venture-backed businesses, is that even though they're doing well and even though they're profitable and even though they're making money, it's not enough, and it's not enough for the investors. And so they have to make cuts and start doing other things to streamline things and be more efficient. And that ends up meaning that people lose their jobs. And
Twitter fell into that boat. I'd argue Reddit also went through that phase.
Totally.
A lot of tech companies go through that. And now we're seeing it happening to the media companies as well.
Totally. And that's an interesting, I guess, kind of distinction between the digital first places and kind of maybe the legacy things. Now, to be clear, legacy companies, especially if they're publicly traded, have a lot of financial impact, and investors can sway those decisions too. But historically, until I'd say like the late 90s, early 2000s, when you really had a lot of consolidation in print, a lot of these were family-owned businesses, and sometimes they were, I'm not going to say vanity projects, but the goal wasn't per se to like make as much money as possible. Mm-hmm. And that's obviously changed in both print and digital, but you didn't have the kind of like, a venture model like you do with digital news, where the people who are investing are the same people who would invest in Reddit or in Twitter or in Facebook. And so, it puts a different spin on things because people expect those type of returns sometimes. And the media business is just different than, creating an app or a startup or a social network.
Yep. And I want to get your opinion on fake news and, that whole thing that that's been coming about lately. I mean, obviously that term, to me, that term means propaganda. In one sense, in one form of it. In another sense, it also means misinformation. I'd love to kind of get your perspective on what fake news means to you and how much you think this might have been a factor in what's kind of been going on lately.
So I think that it's a couple things, like you said. I think that it can be shorthand for propaganda. And I think that sometimes people use it just to describe things that they think are biased in one way or another. So it's not actually fake. They just might not like what the slant is. But then you also have cases where you literally have false information or untrue things that are being that are out there and that are spreading wildly. And in that case, you look at things like Facebook and Twitter, but especially Facebook, have really been drivers of this. You look at some of the things that happening, in Myanmar, where Facebook has been, basically by the UN, like implicated for having a role in genocide because of false information being spread by the government, which is terrible. You have, fake things happening in WhatsApp groups in India that lead to people being killed and mobs forming. You have fringe groups on either side of the political spectrum being able to kind of, incite violence or anger, using these platforms. And in some cases, I think the kind of the original kind of exploration of fake news, not maybe the buzzword that President Trump has said, but the actual, real fake stuff, were things that were just designed to kind of exploit Facebook and to get clicks and to get money. And you had, there were a lot of stories about how those types of farms and operations worked. And I definitely don't want to discount, I think, the impact that those things could have. But I feel like, and the sad thing is that when a lot of the studies were coming up and looking at some of the most engaged, pages and whatnot, they could have a real impact. The interesting thing there, I think, is that many of the people behind those types of sites didn't really, you could call it propaganda, but at the same time, it's kind of not, because the people behind it didn't really care about the ideology. They just wanted to make money. They didn't really care,
Yeah.
whether who was, they just wanted to go after what they felt was the more gullible audience and the audience that's more likely to be enraged and click. It's not about trying to push a certain ideology, which is different, I think, than in some cases where people, like I said, use the term to be more about propaganda or to spread a certain message or I guess, hold down a certain message.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, I almost, I think it's a real problem, but I also feel like in some ways it's been exacerbated, and the term has kind of lost some of its meaning. But I think the issue is that what news publications, regardless of their ideology, regardless of their digital print or whatever, run into, whether they're online or television news or YouTube or whatever, run into, is that what this term has kind of brought up, I think, is that there's a huge amount of distrust overall in the public with media. And that might be founded. Some of it might be founded. Some of it might not be. Some of it might be, exacerbated by other factors. But what that ends up doing is kind of creating this, I think, even more partisan, I guess, just kind of narrative, around or not narrative, but I guess there's more partisan culture. A society becomes
Plays into divide and conquer
completely, and
kind of a propaganda thing as well.
Totally. And I think people, don't trust what they're reading. They don't trust what they're hearing. They're always looking for other options and maybe things that are going to reinforce their own views. And sometimes, and I think that this is something that the news media struggles with, is that people don't trust them, even though very often the mainstream media isn't out to, in my opinion, isn't out to mislead people and isn't out to push an agenda. I think most working reporters are out to report the truth. Everybody, regardless of what they want to admit or not, everyone has an opinion and has bias. But I think plenty of people who are doing reporting aren't trying to get a certain ideology across, aren't trying to push a certain, set of facts out. And what happens is that, the smallest, reporting error becomes blown up and people discount the entire thing, or people will not believe what they're reading because of this perception that fake news is rampant and that nothing can be trusted. And that's really damaging, I think, for the news business, because the media does have an important role, to tell stories and to uncover injustices and to hold people accountable. And when you don't have a free press or a press that's able to, kind of operate, whether it's because of financial concerns or it's because of platforms that are, changing their whims on distribution, or because, readers are only going to want to consume content that adheres to their own opinions, that's I don't think that's good for society.
Greetings, hacker. Ever wonder how to submit stories to Hacker Noon or check the status of your submissions? Well, wonder no more. Go to contribute.hackernoon.com. Whether you're a new writer, longtime contributor, or looking for the right place to spotlight your brand, get started with contribute.hackernoon.com. With your help, we are building Hacker Noon 2.0 to be the best place for tech professionals to publish, and it starts with a new submission flow. Head over to contribute.hackernoon.com today to claim your spot. You are Hacker Noon.
So this brings me to my next question is, what are your thoughts on censorship and what is happening online with deplatforming? I mean, there's been a number of high-profile individuals who have been banned from social media, some people that arguably are journalists, some people that are arguably activists, some people that are arguably, conspiracy theorists.
Mm-hmm.
You have people like Mike Soronovich, a lawyer, documentary filmmaker. He's been deranked on Facebook. So if he goes live, he can't reach his audience. He tweets things regularly that don't reach his audience. So he's just kind of been throttled down. Then you have people like Laura Loomer, who have just been basically deleted from social media. And then you've got like Alex Jones, that's just, he can't even have a bank account. He's had 5 or 6 bank accounts. He was on Joe Rogan recently and talked about all of this. He's down to a single bank account, and he's been labeled a terrorist by like different world governments because of him being deplatformed from these social media sites. I'd love to get your thoughts and your perspective on censorship and all the stuff that's happening on social media, and then how that also kind of ties in and threatens journalism.
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? Like, I want to be kind of careful here because although I'm kind of, in many ways, I am kind of a free speech absolutist, and I'm definitely look, and I just for disclosure, I don't agree politically with any of the individuals that you discussed. That being said, I'm also not in all cases super comfortable with the idea that they don't have the ability to express themselves on social media. That said, I mean, I do feel like it's important to note that, platforms like Facebook and Twitter are private companies. And I'm okay with us acknowledging it, as long as it's acknowledged that they have the rights to pick and choose who can be on their platforms and what content is and is not appropriate. If people ultimately disagree with that and find those constraints to be too much, I mean, then that's fine too. But I don't feel like, I'm not at the point where, even though in many ways these social platforms have become the place that a lot of people get their news and get their information and have become kind of a public square, it's still not. I think that when you look at issues like, whether companies will, host DNS servers for certain content, or, allow, bank accounts and things like that, that becomes a little bit more, for me, a little bit trickier. But I don't feel like any person is required, should be, they're not owed a Twitter account. They're not owed a
Here's
Facebook.
Another example, perhaps. How about Julian Assange? What's your perspective on him and WikiLeaks? Because in my opinion, he's a journalist.
I don't know. I think that I think he could have been, with some of the Chelsea Manning stuff. I think that there's substantial evidence that he might have, he might no longer be acting as a journalist. And I think that if you're accessing information and aiding and getting that information to foreign governments or other things, I personally have a problem with that. But at the same time, if someone's providing him information, I don't know. I think he's a hard case. I think that WikiLeaks has had instances where I would consider what they've done, journalistic, and I think that now, for me anyway, it's harder for me to make that distinction. But I haven't looked into some of the most recent things recently enough. But I mean,
in my thing, it really is what they've done to him as a consequence of it. So whether or not, you agree or disagree that he's a journalist, it's like the fact that he's basically being held in solitary confinement.
Well, I mean, that's different. I mean, that's partially
that's
because
crazy.
That's his own choice to choose to be in that.
Yes and no. If he,
embassy.
The embassy, he's pretty much
done. You're not wrong, but I mean, but those the crimes that he's been accused of in those instances, I think. I mean, look, could you say that it's been exacerbated and people are taking it more seriously because of the information that he revealed, around the Chelsea Manning stuff? Probably, and some of the other things, some of the anonymous stuff, probably. But the fact remains that, like, I personally don't see someone like Edward Snowden and someone like Julian Assange the same way personally. But I can understand the line of thought that people see them similarly, and see them, their plights as similar. I can respect that, I guess. But getting back to your earlier point about deplatforming, I mean, it's hard because abuse and harassment is a real thing happening on social media, and people experience this, and I see it happen to people all the time, and these companies are not doing a good enough job, in my opinion, of addressing that. But at the same time, like, you have to balance that with, well, how far do you go, and what is your role in this? I think that the hard thing has been that historically these companies had taken a hands-off approach and then it switched. And I think that's been the issue. I think that if these companies had been more consistent earlier on about what role they were going to take in, having content guidelines, then it would be different. Yeah, exactly. Having more transparency, then it would be better. I also think that in some cases, people are not necessarily, like, people talk about being shadow banned and things like that. And you see that on both sides of the ideology spectrum, people making those claims. In a lot of those cases, I think there's just algorithms are not great, and that people, because, these things are proprietary, people's minds go into directions that might not be accurate. I'm a big believer in Occam's razor in this case, which is more than in a lot of these cases, I think it's just, the way the code is done, it's kind of a black box and it's not an intentional thing.
Yeah. Code is bias. I mean, the programmer who writes those algorithms or trains that machine learning bot has a personal bias that potentially is going into the code.
Conceivably, but you could also make the case, because I've people who are like Democratic operatives who've been very bothered by saying, oh, my tweets aren't being seen by people and whatnot. And there have been instances where, and that might be true, but part of that is that they have, and we don't know what this is, but there might be signals that say, if you've had a suspension before, if you've had a number of reports before that we've taken action on or whatever, if we've had made you delete things, then that can impact the algorithm and the reach and how often things might show up and suggest it. I don't think that I'm personally not of the opinion that you have people who are working on these products who are making decisions to say, I don't like this content, so I'm purposely targeting this group of people. I think that personally is going too far down like a rabbit hole of intent, where I think most of the engineers aren't thinking about that. They're, thinking about how do we, deal with maybe mass harassment and what signals are we looking for to reduce certain things. And some of that, because of reporting and other things, might impact some people more than others. But to go back to what I was saying earlier, I don't think that, you have like an innate right to a Twitter account or a Facebook account. That's not to say that not having one isn't a problem, but I don't think you have an innate right to that. I also think that, it's difficult for me, as I said, I tend to be more of a free speech absolutist. And so sometimes I look at these things and you have to kind of draw the line, okay, well, where does it go from being speech and where does it go into being, potentially inciting, violence or rhetoric that can really harm people. And I think there are lines. I think that if you're doxing people, and by that, or if you're swatting people, you're actively trying to harm individuals or compel others to harm them, I personally don't think that falls into free speech anymore. I think that goes into something else. And not to say that the individuals who have, been deplatformed have done those things, but just to say I do think that for me personally, just because I believe in free speech doesn't mean that I think that you should be able to, say or do anything or make threats against people, because there is still a line. You can say, I don't like you and this is bad, but not I'm going to kill you or make active threats or say, this is your address and I'm coming after you and this is your social security number and these are other things. But I also, like I said, it's hard for me because ultimately, these platforms do have the right to pick and choose what content they want. What I think it's harder is if you do have platforms that have different standards and then their underlying infrastructure, doesn't want to host them and whatnot. I have a much harder time with that. Again, I still feel like if a company wants to say, we don't want you on our servers, that's fine. And they have every right to do that. But there might be certain, there's certain things, that I don't know. For me, it's complicated. I struggle with that a lot.
Is if I violate the rules on Twitter, I get banned from Facebook. Or
right.
If I violate the rules on Patreon, I get my business bank account deleted.
Right. Yeah. I agree with that.
That's crazy to me.
Or to go, the Julian Assange stuff, I was very bothered and continue to be bothered that when, WikiLeaks' PayPal and things like that were shut down and the credit card processors were removing their ability to do things. Not to say that they, again, if MasterCard doesn't want to do business with you, they don't have to, but your Patreon being shut down, I agree with you. I don't like that could impact your bank account. I don't like how some of these digital tools can act, I guess, like real banks. PayPal being a good example. They're not a bank. They have a lot of, you don't have the same protections as you would with a bank, but yet they have a lot of the impunity to act.
At this point, they're pretty close to a bank. You can get, insured accounts. You can get loans.
Can, but they're not. But they're not a bank. What I'm saying is they get all the advantages of being a bank without
being a
right.
bank.
And so, which I think is a problem, right? And I think that's actually a problem beyond any sort of political things. Like, I think that you see a lot of people who, if they sell things online and they have, scammers or fraudsters doing chargebacks or doing other things where their money can be kept in escrow, like unilaterally, it's not a good situation. It's one of those things where it's like, if you have a lot of money in PayPal, you should be moving that out into actual bank accounts as soon as possible. Is like, for me, that is actually completely separate from any sort of speech issues. But I do feel like we do kind of go into this area where you have a lot of disruptive technologies that take on the same role as, very regulated industries, but then don't have the same responsibilities or legal responsibilities as those regulated industries because they're not part of it. And that's disturbing for me.
Yeah, I agree. I'd like to shift the conversation a little bit and talk about what you're working on now, because we've kind of covered the medium, and media spectrum. But you've left journalism. You're now at Microsoft. You're now focusing on on cloud. Can you talk a little bit about what you're working on now and kind of why you made that decision to get out of the journalism space?
Yeah. Well, I mean, kind of as we talked about, between when I left and now, it's been almost 2 years. There's been, like, the industry's not good. It's not in a great place. A lot of my friends have lost their jobs or are really worried about their jobs. And that's really disappointing and depressing. I've always been kind of, and you're like this too, right? Where I've always kind of been tied between kind of two worlds. I love media, but I also love technology. And so what I'm doing now, in a lot of ways, I kind of get to do both. I still, do my own podcasts, and I still get to go on other people's podcasts. But I'm helping, tell stories and talk to people and hopefully have product impact on tools that people use. And so as a cloud advocate, I mean, that's a lot of what I do. Is I work with product teams to really try to get feedback from our users, to make Azure as good as it can be, and taking the good and the bad. So if somebody's saying, I can't use this because of this blocker, I want to be able to take that feedback to the product groups and let them know, hey, this is what's happening. Or if there might be a technical reason why something doesn't work the way someone wants, I want to be able to explain to them, okay, we hear you, but this is a much, this is a broader problem to think about. And so we have a YouTube channel, Microsoft Developer, where there's a lot of developer content that's created every week. And I help do a lot of the kind of the strategy on that. I host some of those videos. I also, at conferences, will give talks and do interviews, kind of like what you're doing, with other developers to talk about, the latest new things and how they work. It's a lot of fun. So for me, I've always kind of lived in these two worlds where I really like software and I really like, the web and building things, but I also really like to write. And before I became a journalist, I was doing a lot of, web dev stuff and still kind of dabbled with that. And now I'm just kind of back on that part of my brain, but still, writing and telling stories and doing videos, just, from a different perspective.
And for some context for the listeners, Microsoft's cloud division is doing really well. They just had incredible earnings recently. They acquired GitHub. Microsoft today is a completely different company than they were even probably 5 years ago. They've doubled down on open source initiatives. They've kind of shifted a lot of the ideology of kind of the kind of proprietary and closed, way that things used to happen under kind of the Ballmer and Gates days. Those days are pretty much over at Microsoft, and it's kind of a new day there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, since Satya Nadella took over, I think everybody is kind of, there's been, I wasn't at the company obviously before he joined, but there's been, it's been different. And there's kind of a new vibe. Many of the people that I work with, a lot of the people on my team are brand new to the company. A lot of us have open source backgrounds and never would have thought that we would work at Microsoft. I use a Mac, a Microsoft issued Mac, but at least from my perspective and what I've been able to observe, one of the reasons that I even originally kind of took the call and was interested in doing the interview process and going to work at Microsoft was because I'd already noticed as a user that things had changed. And then I was convinced of that when I was in the interview, and I've become more convinced of that now that I'm at the company. And I think that's really exciting. It's cool to see, like the reaction to the GitHub acquisition was interesting because obviously there were a lot of people who were understandably nervous about this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I completely understand that. I'm a huge GitHub fan. I've been, a user since like 2009, and I understand the caution. But it wasn't what I think it would have been even 3 years ago, where there was a lot more. I think because of things like Visual Studio Code and, a WSL, the Windows subsystem on Linux, and more of the commitment to open source, there was more of a kind of like, there's still a hesitancy, but a lot of people in the community were more like, okay, this makes sense, and this might not be bad. Seeing what happened with the Xamarin acquisition and some of the other acquisitions that have happened, to see that, hey, these teams have still been able to do what they want to do, has been, helpful and hopeful. And I mean, I think that's all we can kind of do is to kind of show that, the company is evolving and understands that it's not the past anymore. I would say the biggest challenge, I mean, one of the challenges that we have as advocates, and you have to kind of acknowledge, like, some of the people you're talking to have had bad experiences. And, yes, Steve Ballmer said that Linux is a cancer, in like 2001. But also I kind of want to say, but it was 2001, like it's not 1997 anymore. And like I most of my friends are iOS and Mac OS developers. And, and I was an Apple beat reporter for a long time. And so it was really funny for people. They're like, oh, but you're an Apple person at Microsoft. I'm like, well, yeah, because it's not 1997 anymore, we ultimately want to build tools that, developers can use regardless of what platform you're on. If you use Windows, that's great. If you use Linux, that's great. If you use Mac, that's great. Whatever. We want to have, our cloud, we want it to be the best for everybody. And that wasn't always the strategy. But that is now. And now we kind of have to prove ourselves and be like, hey, this is how, we're talking the talk. Now we have to prove ourselves and walk the walk. You can say all the right things, you can hire all the right people, but we have to continue to prove it to the users. And that's what we're trying to do. And that's why, me and the people on that I work with genuinely want to get the feedback. And we genuinely want to make, those connections and be able to impact product the right way. Because I don't want to just tell people, oh, everything's awesome. I want to be able to actually help make things, as good as possible, and continue to evolve and continue to give back. And I mean, even this week, it was really awesome. I think actually the Windows calculator went open source, and it's a UWP app, but if somebody wanted to write a different wrapper for it, even though it would be harder to do, you could do it. But it's written in C++. And so really you've got this great, like very good calculator kind of logic that's now open source. They have a roadmap. It went open source yesterday as we're recording this. And already I was looking through the pull requests and the issues on GitHub, and was really impressed with how the people on that team are responding and engaging, and also, kind of lolling at some of the suggestions. But it's really cool to see, because like this is an app that, it's a calculator, and it seems small, but it's a good example of how to build something, and B, when you have that kind of logic, like you can build that into other applications. And I don't know, I think that's like not something that would have happened 5 years ago. And so I like seeing things like that happen. I like seeing, the company surprises me a lot, and that makes me happy to work here and to do what I do, and to be able to, tell people, hey, we're listening, and feel like that's actually true. Because if that weren't true, I wouldn't be here. Like full stop. Like I'm not going to work someplace if I feel like I can't support what they're doing. And that doesn't mean that there aren't things that we can improve on, and we're actively working to do that. But we're trying, and like you said, yeah, I mean, and cloud is a competitive space. There are a lot of options for a lot of different people. And There are some really good things that other people are doing that I think is awesome, and I try to keep up with that. But we're just trying to make things as good as they can be for all developers, regardless of what platform they're on or, what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. And you covered, as you mentioned, you covered Apple, and you were basically an Apple beat reporter for quite a while. What are your thoughts on Apple today versus, kind of, you were basically covering, the Steve Jobs era, the end of it, coming up into the transition into the Tim Cook era. And then, now you've kind of left journalism. So I'd be really curious to kind of get your thoughts over the last couple of years on, where Apple's kind of gone and what they've been up to.
Yeah, no, I'm still a big Apple user, big Apple fan. I always buy the latest iPhone and iPad and stuff. I think AirPods are one of the greatest products to come out in years. The Apple Watch, I think, has morphed into a really good product. Apple's an interesting company. It's hard because, for a lot of Apple fans, I think especially, the company has changed. And this happened under Steve Jobs, but it's really happened under Tim Cook. And that, I think for a lot of us, like when you were doing Apple News and Rumors and stuff, they were the underdog. So, a lot of Mac fans and Apple fans are, I think, by default, overly defensive.
Yeah.
And people do like to treat their computing platforms, whether it's, Android or iOS or Mac or Windows or Linux or whatever, or Chrome or whatever, as sports teams. And, Apple is the Patriots. And so, they're the biggest, they're the most profitable. And that puts, I think sometimes that means they get criticized more than they should. And I think sometimes, it means that some of the fans need to sometimes be less defensive. And it's like, okay, chill, because they're fine. I think that some of the business critiques are misguided in the sense that, Apple is doomed. It's like, they're not doomed. Like, they're, the most profitable company in the world. It's
sitting on a pile of cash.
Completely. They're completely fine.
They could just stop selling products tomorrow and operate for another 10 years without,
if not longer, the exact same things they're doing. Yeah, no, precisely. And so, I think Apple, but there are, changes happening, and there are maybe things that aren't, there are struggles that they deal with, that every company deals with. And I think part of that is just adjusting to being a bigger company and being in a global environment, the having to adjust the sales projections last financial quarter because of what they said was softer, sales in China was interesting because that hadn't happened before. And I think that was definitely one of those issues.
You also had the battery scandal.
Yeah.
That was a big one. They did not anticipate that many people were going to replace their batteries and not buy new iPhones.
You're right. But I would say on that, in some cases, I don't, I think we're at a point, and I don't think it's unique to just Apple, but I think Apple in some cases has a harder time with this because their products tend to, in my experience, work better longer. Is we've almost reached peak phone where, the software isn't using all the features that the hardware has available for it. And we're kind of waiting for that next big breakthrough, whether it's AR or whether it's something else. And so most people, if you have an iPhone 6S, that's going to be fine. And a lot of people aren't going to notice a demonstrable difference between that and an iPhone 10s. And that's the reality of what happens when markets become saturated and when we reach peak computing cycles. The same thing happens, or has happened with laptops. And, but there are certain applications and certain things people do that can push computing, people needing to upgrade. But it's hard, it's like, yeah, you're right. They probably didn't expect as many people to just replace the battery because that was why they were upgrading a phone every year. It's also true. Cell phones are hard because you used to have in the United States carrier subsidies, and you don't have that anymore. And now people have, payment plans. And so that's kind of what Apple's shifting to. And the other manufacturers are doing that too, where they're trying to get people to just pay monthly. And just always.
Even I pay monthly now, and
I do too. That's one of the reasons
it makes no sense.
Right. You're renting your phone, and I used to be like, oh, I'm not going to do that. And I resisted for years and years. Then I realized I was like, I literally buy a new phone every single year.
Yep.
And then sometimes
it works in your favor.
Yeah, it does. Like if you're that person, it really does make sense. If you're not, it maybe doesn't. But if you're the type of person who's upgrading every year or every other year, yeah, it's certainly not a bad idea. Especially if you're not somebody who wants to keep your phone after you got rid of it. If you're not,
I used to resell them anyways, and I would take them. I would just go on Craigslist, resell my old iPhone, take that money, put it towards the new model.
I would do the exact same thing.
It would be like $100, $200 offset. But I realized even in doing that with financing and doing like the upgrade programs, you're actually saving that $300 in the end. So, and you're only basically paying for about half the phone if you upgrade early. So the math is bizarre, and it's the strangest thing because much like you, I did not want to give up owning my phone. But at the same time, there was really no point to owning it anymore because they've become disposable. And that would be my biggest complaint against Apple right now is their products have become disposable. I miss the days of, buying a Mac that I knew was going to last me 5 years.
Yeah.
These days are over.
Yeah. I mean, I've had some of the issues with the keyboard on the new MacBook Pro. I haven't had to get it replaced, but I have had to, pull out the compressed air. I feel really convinced that my 2017 5K iMac will be around for 5 years, but I also spent a lot of money on it. And that's one of the few, things that has easily user accessible RAM upgrades.
I'm on one right now, and mine's been committing suicide.
Okay, yeah, mine is good. Knock on wood, but yeah, I also got the Apple Care. But you're right. I mean, but I'm going to be honest. Like, I don't think that's just Apple. I think that's technology in general. And for those of us
who has a lot of blame in this, actually, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Their chipset quality has declined significantly, especially when it comes to mobile. They just can't cool them appropriately. It's become a major problem. And then they made the actual devices too thin because of Johnny Ives and his obsession with thinness. And you just can't cool the processors, so they have to throttle them.
They have to throttle them down. Yeah, you're right. And it's weird too because in some cases, like we're nerds, so we feel that every little bit of throttling we get annoyed with. But there are plenty of people who, Chromebooks sell really well for a reason, and people use older MacBook Airs and older computers all the time. And they use them for years longer than what we used to because a lot of our workloads are in the cloud and a lot of the software we use is in a web browser. And really, the thing you care about is that Chrome is shitting the bed, and that really doesn't have anything to do with what processor you have. Like that's all about JavaScript and optimization. That's not really about.
I still use Safari. It handles JavaScript way better than Chrome.
I agree.
And Apple did a really good job, and they just completely get written off when you talk to most developers. They're like, "Oh, I only use Chrome," and I'm like, "Why?"
I mean, I'm with you. I use it a lot too. The problem is Tom Warren, no relation, at The Verge wrote a great thing a couple of years ago about how, Chrome is the new IE or whatever. But it's kind of true in that people do build for, Chrome for Blink. And so even though WebKit and Blink are really similar, there are still differences between, what you can, what works on one and what works on another. I mean, we saw that same thing happen with Edge, the Edge browser, and that's one of the reasons why that's moving to a Chromium base. Is that people just it was hard for devs and people to build things for it and to get support for it, because people build websites for Chrome. That becomes the de facto thing, and I don't think that's great. I don't think anything should be like I'm about standards, but that is what it is. But you're right. Yeah. Safari is definitely better when it comes to memory performance and things like that for that reason. But,
Apple was able to optimize their hardware to their software in that particular use case, whereas Google's just like, whatever.
Well, Google has different goals, right? And that's, and also I think that, your number of users. I mean, look, we even saw that with Firefox, if we're going to be honest. Like, it got to a point where I would say, like the 2007, 2008 era Firefox, before Chrome came out, Firefox felt bloated and slow. A lot of that was extensions. And that's the same thing that happens, I think, with Chrome. It's not so much Chrome itself, that you have a lot of extensions that have other options and whatnot. And then the way that people build web browsers, or not web browsers, websites now, is way more intensive and
completely changed.
Completely.
Yeah. I mean, I ran a WordPress theme and plugin company for 5 years, and I sold it 3 years ago, and even in the last 3 years, everything's changed. It's not even close to being the same.
Yeah, no, WordPress is now basically JavaScript, which is really funny because it was always, like the PHP thing. And now, they have
yes.
Yeah, I mean, they're trying to make it more React.
Still a PHP stack, but the front end is moving more JavaScript. So it's we're going through some crazy times in the tech space. I mean, things are just moving so fast, especially, when you look at what's happening in blockchain and AI and some of the other stuff we haven't even covered or talked about yet. And, this interview, I feel like you and I could go on for hours. We could. We're already about, 50 something minutes here. So I'm going to try and wrap this one up. So I've got to ask you, what is some time in your life that you've had to hack something?
God. Oh, God. So do you mean like having to break into something? Like what do you hack? Like do you mean like having to hack something together? Do you mean like having to like literally break a password or something? Like what do you mean?
I don't know. What comes to your mind? I mean, so this is the Hacker Noon podcast. So
yes.
We've got hackers who are biohackers, who are life hackers. We've got hackers who are building robots that are security experts. All that kind of stuff. So what comes to mind? What does hacking mean to you? And when's some time that you've used that in your life?
God. So, I mean, I've definitely had to break into Wi-Fi networks before, whether it was because I just needed access to something, or in some cases because, maybe it was like the people weren't around and you needed to get into things for those purposes.
That's a pretty good one to me. I mean,
you're
talking to a guy who I did a live stream blog of a Steve Jobs keynote with a hacked V710 phone because they turned the Wi-Fi off.
Oh, that's so good. I love it.
Yeah, I was the only guy who got a feed out because I was on like the original. I think it was. I don't even know if it was 3G yet. I think we were still on like 2. So I think it was the Edge network that actually.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so good.
So I was the only feed of that particular keynote. That was probably, I don't even remember what year that was. It was like probably something like that.
Did they catch you?
No, they did not catch me because they couldn't, it wasn't Wi-Fi. So they couldn't figure out how I had a signal. So I had hacked my V710 to be able to do that. So I can understand as a journalist in situations where you want to cover things, like needing to hack into Wi-Fi, like that's a hack.
In this case, it was actually, okay, I didn't want to share the whole context because it was kind of sad, but my aunt and uncle died in a car accident, and they didn't have kids. And so we went to their house and we're trying to, find the documents and things like that. And, I had to break into the Wi-Fi router and whatnot so that we could access things. In other cases, I mean, we talk about Apple stuff. So I have my own like iMac, and I have, like I said, a work issued MacBook Pro, and I have other laptops, but I bought this Huawei MateBook X Pro, which is a shameless knockoff of a MacBook, but it's great hardware. And I'm in the process, I have to get a Wi-Fi dongle, ironically, because the onboard Wi-Fi doesn't work, but I'm in the process of Hackintoshing that actually.
Okay.
And so, and that's always fun. I like to do things.
You're Hackintoshing a laptop.
Yeah, which is hard. I mean, you can
get a different challenge.
Yeah, it is, because the big thing is it has a discrete graphics card, but because of how the graphic stuff is, getting access to that isn't possible. So you have to, use the integrated, but getting I guess the performance so that it's accelerated is the issue.
Uh-huh.
So, which is oftentimes the same thing if you want to do it in virtualization, like with a QEMU or whatever, is the big issue there with Mac virtualization is usually the acceleration. So I'm playing with that. But I mean, that's just fun stuff to do, Yeah.
Awesome. Well, do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up? I know we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of stuff. No, I mean, I think that like Hacker Noon is just cool because it shows people how to do cool things. I mean, I just always say, continue building cool stuff. That's just my favorite thing to see, period. Whether it's, and whether it's in news or it's, around, tech or whatever. Like that's what makes all of this so fun. That's what drew me to the web originally. It's just the fact that you can build anything and tell stories. And
that's why I got involved, because I've seen this evolution of these media companies time and time again, much like you have as well. And Hacker Noon is like kind of on the cusp of becoming that next big tech company, or that next big, tech media kind of platform. It's cool because it's contributor based. We're crowdsourcing most of the content. We just had a successful fundraise, and we're moving off Medium. So that's really,
Oh, that's awesome. I'd love to talk to you more sometime about that and that process, because that's really interesting.
Yeah, I might have to stop recording if we want to have that conversation. Totally. But yeah, we're in the process of doing that right now. So I don't know. We'll see. We might be on the new platform by the time this episode airs. So I'm not sure yet. We might get you out right before the transition, but we'll see. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff happening in this space, and Hacker Noon's been an interesting one because it's been able to survive while all these other media publications have been failing, and it's actually been created within the last 2 to 3 years while all this chaos has been happening that we just talked about, and it's been successful. So it's very interesting to see where this can go,
awesome.
Because I don't know, this is how these tech companies work. You kind of go through these cycles. You do. You see these trends emerging, and I hopped on the Hacker Noon wave because I was like, okay, this one's going to get bigger.
That's awesome. That's great.
So, and I just want to thank you for coming on the show. This has been amazing. We've covered a lot of ground, and we hit some hard topics. And I think the audience is definitely going to be very interested in your insight. Considering you've covered this industry for so long from so many different perspectives, it's always great to get someone's opinion, that especially as a journalist and now someone who's on the other side, who's working, with product and working with product teams and communicating with users and that kind of thing. It's powerful stuff. So thank you again for coming on the show. Where can people find you?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at film_girl. I do a podcast called Rocket with Brianna Wu and Simone de Rochefort on Relay FM. So it's relay.fm/rocket. And we cover kind of tech news, but also pop culture stuff. And you can see the videos that I do at work at youtube.com/Microsoft developer. So check that out.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you.
This concludes another episode of the Hacker Noon podcast. I'm your host, Trent Lapinski. Please don't forget to subscribe to us on iTunes and YouTube, and follow us on social media. You can also find us at hackernoon.com and podcast.hackernoon.com for more episodes. Thank you for listening.